to Product Huddle, the podcast where we talk about the real product management, not the theory version they teach in bootcamps. I'm Anna, here with Jeff, and today we're diving into a topic that every PM faces, but almost nobody talks about it, honestly. The politics of prioritization.
Yeah, if you've ever been in a prioritization meeting where every single stakeholder insisted their request is the most critical, this episode is going to feel very familiar.
Yeah. And because the truth is, prioritization isn't hard because of frameworks, prioritization is hard because of people.
Exactly. Nobody argues with a spreadsheet. People argue because they have targets and pressures and ego and territory and emotions, and they expect the PM to magically balance it all.
Yeah, that is so true. So let's start with the biggest myth. We prioritize based on data. No, we prioritize based on data, power, politics, timing, influence, and sometimes who has the CEO's private Slack channel.
Right. I've never seen a roadmap debate end with, oh, you're right. The Rice score is 7.4. Let's all go home. No, somebody's always saying, okay, but, and then dropping in a reason that has absolutely nothing to do with the data.
Yeah, because frameworks are neutral. People aren't, however. Jeff, so what's really happening behind the scenes when somebody says, but this is urgent?
Well, most urgency is manufactured. Here's some of the things that I think are usually happening. First and foremost, somebody's covering their ass. They made a promise to somebody that they shouldn't have made. They missed a deadline a few weeks ago. Now they're trying to create the appearance that the product team is the bottleneck. The urgency isn't about the feature in that case. It's about their credibility. Sometimes it's a negotiating tactic. If I call everything urgent, maybe something will get prioritized. Basically, they're playing poker with the roadmap. They're hoping that you're going to fold while they're bluffing. Sometimes they're confusing customer noise with customer value. You had one loud customer that complained about things, and now it feels like the sky is falling. One data point isn't data, it's just a point. Sometimes it's territorial. Um, Resources matter. My department matters. My department needs resources. My needs matter. If you don't prioritize my thing, then you're saying I don't matter. And the urgency is really about status, resources, and influence. Sometimes it's about their bonus check is being measured by a certain set of KPI that's different from another team's bonus check. Now, sometimes it's actually urgent. And these things happen. You have a security issue, you have a regulatory requirement, you have some kind of contractual obligation with financial penalties. And these things exist, but they're maybe 10% of the urgent requests that you get. The PM's job is to figure out which 10% is real and which 90% is just performance art. And I find that if you ask the people who are proposing the item these two questions, you can kind of sort that out. What happens if we don't do this? And when would that actually happen? And if they can't answer both with specifics, or if the when is 6 months down the road, it's not urgent. They're just being loud. And I think there's an old saying that if everything's priority number one, then nothing is. And if you're dealing with a world like that, then you're really not a PM anymore. You're really just serving up features. You're a feature waiter.
Yeah, it all sounds very familiar.
So let's break down the four classic characters of stakeholders that show up in these different prioritization conversations.
Yeah, I think that's good. So for number one, the revenue hero, translation would be if we don't build this feature, we'll lose 200K euros or dollars next quarter.
Yeah, the revenue hero doesn't really care about the long term. They're focused on next quarter's quota and hitting some numbers.
Yeah. Then number two, the vision founder. I had a dream at 3 a.m. and we need this feature No, I don't have data, I have vibes.
Yeah, there's usually a lot of coffee involved in this one, and you just can't out logic that founder's adrenaline rush.
Yeah. Number 3, the squeaky wheel. One customer emailed me yesterday, and so obviously this needs to be a top priority.
Yeah, this is the problem. One noisy user, it does not equal a strategy.
Number 4, the engineering gatekeeper. Everything is 6 weeks minimum, even changing a tooltip.
Yeah. I've I've talked to those gatekeepers, and it's always either 6 weeks or 6 months, depending on whether they've started on it or not.
Yeah. Uh, but here's the real challenge. What happens when two of these archetypes are in direct conflict? Like when the revenue hero and the vision founder want completely opposite things?
Well, first of all, you don't try and just compromise, because that's how you end up with a feature that's not going to make anybody happy and ultimately solves nothing. What I would do instead is start by making the conflict visible. We try and, as PMs, we try and absorb all this tension and make everybody feel heard. And a lot of times that works, but in this particular case, I think it's the wrong move. Instead, you're like, sales wants this feature because it's going to drive 200,000 in revenue, and engineering's focused on paying down technical debt. We can't do both, so let's talk about what the trade-offs are. And if you make them see each other and make them understand that there's a choice that they're forcing here. Second thing is to reframe it around strategies, not just preferences. Tie it back to the North Star for the company, tie it back to the recent business strategy, you know, force the conversation to move up a level. And so that it's not just about somebody's personal preferences, it's about strategy. And a lot of times, if that strategy has already been published and it's out there for people to look at, it can be the objective source of reality. Like we said 3 months ago, this was our strategy for 2026. And so this is aligned with that strategy, and that's not aligned with the strategy. Then you basically also need to try and create a decision framework in the moment. So here are the 3 criteria that we decided when we did our last strategy, that these were the things that mattered the most. Let's score both of those options against these 3 things, and whatever wins is that's what we execute. So then the process is at least fair, and as a product person, you've got to hold the line. In the end, though, you got to know when you're going to need to escalate, because I'd say it's revenue hero versus the vision founder, but the vision founder is the CEO. You're not going to mediate that solution. You're going to focus on executing. In another scenario where you've got peers, VP peers who are arguing about it, that needs executive alignment. That's not something that the PM's going to be able to sort out. It's got to get bounced up a level. The worst thing you can do in all of this is pretend that you can make everybody happy. You can't when you're in a situation like this. So you've got to make the trade-offs clear and get a decision. Um, One of the things that we use to do these types of prioritizations is frameworks. Um, Rice, Moscow, all of them useful, but they don't always solve the real problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, frameworks don't stop politics. They just give you structure before the politics start.
Yeah, so if frameworks don't solve the problems, do you have any thoughts on when PMs should actually use a framework?
Yes. So there are times when you should use the framework, and that's mostly about timing and context. So is it like early in the process to align before stakeholder meetings, to document decisions, to create shared language? So it should be about mechanism that you can rely on more of than focusing and detaining yourself from politics, like we already mentioned. So frameworks should help you to make decisions faster and test it faster and release whatever you have faster, not to stop you from it and to create decision fatigue. So that would be my thoughts on frameworks. But I have a question for you, Jeff. So you've been doing this for a long time. Have you ever seen a prioritization framework actually work? What made it work?
Yeah, I have. And here's the thing. It was working because it was simple. The people that I coach have heard me talk about the value to effort matrix. And I did this with my wife when she was struggling with what to focus on. She had a million things pulling at her, and the things she was doing, they weren't really filling her cup. So I took this value to effort matrix and I adapted it for her. And I said, for you, value means how much does this fill my cup? And effort meant how much does it drain my battery? And so it's a simple process. Make your list of the things that you're trying to prioritize, 10, 15, 20 items, whatever. Go through and rate them high, medium, or low. Do all the value ones first so that you get consistency between the scoring, and then go through and do high, medium, and low for effort. And now you've got 3 tiers. You have the green tier. That's what I call the profit tier. These are the things where value exceeds effort. You're making a profit off of these things, getting more bang for the buck. You're getting more than you put in. And you want to do that stuff all day long. The next tier is is the yellow tier, or what I call the break-even tier. And that's where value equals effort. And you do these things when you've exhausted all of your green tier stuff, or for strategic reasons, you'll dip into the yellow tier. Then you have the third tier, the red tier, the what I call the subsidy tier, and this is where the effort exceeds the value. You're putting in more than you're getting back, and sometimes you have to do these things. It's regulatory stuff, it's contractual obligations, there's legal reasons, but you need to know that you're eating a shit sandwich when you do it, and you try and minimize the amount of time that you spend on those things. So when I was doing this with my wife, the whole thing took 10 or 15 minutes. I drew it on the back of a piece of paper with highlighters. She took the results and it's hanging on her wall in her office now. And here's why it worked. First of all, it forced her to be honest about what was draining her value versus what was feeding her. Second, it gave her a framework to say no. She has a lot of opportunities, and you need to have a way to say, this isn't the right idea for me. It doesn't align with my North Star. And then third, and this is critical, it was quick enough that she could actually do it instead of spending weeks building some elaborate scoring model that you use once and never use again. You can spend a lot of time creating these detailed models with weightings and all this complexity. And directionally, you're not going to get a result that's much different than the 10 minutes you spent on a quick and dirty value to effort matrix. And here's the money part. You can get back to actually doing the work, because that's where the money's made, not the planning. It's made in the doing.
Oh, so thoughtful. But also, I think we need to realize that we can't avoid politics as a PM. That's that's something that we can only dream about, but we need to face it and we need to be realistic. Um, and I think we can share more on how the real PMs survive the politics. So here's the playbook. First, always start with what are you optimizing for? If people can't answer that, then they shouldn't be deciding priorities, right? Second, tie every request to an OKR, no emotions. Third, replace no with happy to build it. What should we remove to make room?
You got to do that.
And fourth, timestamp the backlog. So when someone says, why isn't it done yet? You can say you deprioritized it on March 4th at 2:17 p.m.
Yeah, and please, one other one. Pre-align before the meeting, and If you're fighting battles during the call, you're already losing the fight.
Oh, yeah, that's a very important one. Jeff, let's dig into the last one. What does pre-align before the meeting actually mean? Give us a concrete example.
Yeah, so when you're sitting down and you're thinking about the presentation that you're going to give, you already should have a sense of the room that you're walking into, right? You know some people who are potentially going to be allies for you. You know people who are potentially going to be roadblocks for you. Don't walk into a room full of people and have that be the first time that these key stakeholders are seeing the work. Set up a one-on-one. This is hard work, but you identify those key allies and those people that are most likely to be blockers, and you schedule a one-on-one pre-read. You get in there, you gather support from your allies, you identify objections in advance from the people that you think are going to be blockers, so that you're not hearing that for the first time when you walk into the room. If you do that, what you'll often find is by going into your allies will be your allies, but what really transforms are the blockers, because they feel heard now. You've had an opportunity to hear their objections. Hopefully you've taken some of that into consideration, so that when you do the the big presentation in front of everybody, maybe you've addressed some of those objections and you know that they're out there. You find frequently that those blockers become your best allies in the room because you've gone through this process. So it really does change the entire politics of that situation. So,
Right.
I was thinking about this. I have a question for you. Um, What's your favorite way to say no without actually saying no?
To be fair, I don't like saying no, but it is needed. So I would say you need to approach it differently depending on the situation and the person that you're talking to. Um, Preferably, you know that person already, so you know how to approach the person. But I would say the one that we mentioned, where you remind them of, okay, but we planned for this and this. Should that stay as a plan? Or should we do a prioritization and reprioritize other things, as the person mentioned, some other features or whatever? So should we focus on that? And then remind that person that also that doesn't mean that you can, in some cases you can, but in some other cases you just can't start working on it right away, right? So you need some pre-work in order to start working on it. Um, so I would say a lot of questions, valid questions, obviously, and that usually reminds them that they have to make a decision, um, and they they respond, um, in 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 um, in my case, so they respond and they say no for me.
Right.
Nah, I don't have to say no. So I think that would be my favorite one, to kind of remind people of where we're going, and they just decide what is like the best scenario for all of us. Um, so yeah, I think that's the most useful one for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. For early stage founders listening, yes, prioritization is different when you don't have data yet.
And no, you don't need a roadmap when you're trying to find product market fit. You need bets, not commitments.
And if your investor is secretly acting like your product owner, congratulations. Your product has a boss you didn't hire. But let's get practical here. How do you actually push back on a founder's 3 a.m. idea without getting fired?
That's a great question. And I've had this come up fairly recently. Um, what I think we come back around to helping to have them make the prioritization decisions. Very few founders have unlimited resources to spend on everything. And so there's a lot of very tight prioritization decisions that happen here. And it's almost always going to be a one for one trade off because usually they're working with small development teams. So if Bob's not working on project A or feature A, he's working on feature B, but he can't do feature A and B at the same time, right? So you basically have to go back to, this is a great idea, but um, is this a version 1 idea? Is this a version 2 idea? Um, we've framed our minimum sellable product, and this is the feature set that we agreed on. If we wedge this in there, does it affect the launch date? Does it affect the resource usage? More than likely, it's going to have some impact on launch date. And if that launch date is something that you're locked into, then that can be a real problem.
Oh yeah, that that totally makes sense. And now, while we're talking, how about investors? Are investors your boss also? They're technically not your boss, but they definitely have influence. So how do you handle that?
Very carefully, right? Because investors are your money and your money is your heir. But your investors are not your ideal customer profile usually. If they are, then what they have to say, definitely perk up and listen. But very frequently, um, they're not the ICP, and so you've got to remember that you're actually building a product that's designed to solve a problem in the market. And if the investors aren't experiencing that problem, then adding, so here's an example of a project that I saw where they very clearly added something into the product just because they wanted to attract investors. I saw a pitch once for a tequila brand, and the tequila brand, regular old tequila, but they were packaging NFTs. This was back in the blockchain craze. They were packaging NFTs with the tequila. And I was like, how does the NFT make the tequila taste any better? You know, the NFTs and the blockchain aspect were there to attract investors. But unless the investors were going to drink a lot of tequila, then adding that piece to it was not necessarily adding anything that the customer was going to value. And so you have to just understand that you have investors, you have customers, and very rarely do they overlap. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm just like while you were talking, I was just thinking about all the situations I've been where I realized that we're just gonna cater to investors. We're not gonna build like a product that should be done in the first place. We will actually cater to the investors. And don't get me wrong, investors are very important, and you should have a very good relationship and communication with an investor. But if you can, by any means, to choose to work on a product with an investor that is not choosing features um, because some vanity project, some vanity reason, but rather that has direct impact on the users and second of all, monetization, then honestly, yeah, I think now when I'm thinking of it, it's usually the point where I will say, okay, either this changes or I should find some other work.
Yeah.
But then again, yeah, you can't do that when you're just starting. You need to learn. You want all the opportunities. So yeah, but hopefully that doesn't happen to anyone who's listening to us, and that will never happen to them. And these are just like mythical stories for them to
Yes.
hear.
So I was thinking about, how this works within an organization, and a lot of the things that get said to the product person to try to convince them that there's that they can do a feature request or something. And so there's some red flags that when you hear them, you're like, oh no. Red flag number one, we promised this to a customer already. Another one, we'll just slot it in. It's it's only a small change. This will only take a few hours, right? I've even been guilty of that last one because I anticipated what I thought it was going to be in terms of a lift for the developers, and when I told them what we were trying to do, and they said, oh no, that's actually a big deal, and here's why, and you're like, oh. So I'll even say that I've been guilty of some of these before. So
Yeah, I agree. I think we can all agree that we've been guilty of that kind of behavior in total. So also about those lines. Um, and I would mention some lines that will probably save your sanity. So what I would add in that pile would be, before we add this, what should we delay or cancel as an answer? Then also, I think what's very useful to have in mind is, let's validate the priority, not the idea, as an
good one.
answer to some of the questions from investors and founders and stakeholders in general. And also, we can do anything, but we cannot do everything, especially at this moment. I think that kind of sets them back, and they regroup and think more about, okay, yeah, you're right. We should be smarter and more strategical about these decisions.
Exactly.
Yeah, so let's talk about the first red flag that you mentioned. We promised this to a customer already. That's a tough one, because now that's a tough one because now you're dealing with a commitment that was made without you. How do you handle that?
Well, the very first question that I'm going to ask is there a signed contract with revenue attached? Because if there's not, then nobody's really promised anyone anything. Someone said something, and what people say and what they commit to are two different things. So this is how I would assess: is it real or sales posturing? Is it in writing? If it's not in the contract, it's not a promise, it's just a conversation. Two, is there a financial penalty if we don't deliver? If there's no penalty clause, there's no revenue at risk, no consequences, then it's not binding, it's aspirational. Third, did anyone from product or engineering actually sign off on the timeline? Because if the answer is no, then the sales team went rogue. And you can't let sales just write checks that product and engineering have to cash. So here's the hard part. What do you do about it? Sometimes it's going to be a real commitment, that signed contract. There's revenues, there's penalties. You might just have to eat it. You sit down with the engineering team, you figure out the minimum viable version that technically meets the commitment, and that becomes what you deliver. And then you make damn sure that everybody knows that this was a one-off. It's not the new normal. If it's not a real commitment, and 80% of the time it's not, you go back to sales and you say, I need to understand what was actually promised versus what you hoped we could deliver, because right now this isn't on the roadmap. And adding it means that something else doesn't get built. So what are we not doing to make room for this? And then here's the key. You make them make the trade-off. You don't say no. Like you were saying, you say, yes, we can do this. Which of these three things that are currently committed to do we need to delay or cancel to make room? You force the conversation. You make the costs visible to the people who are in play here. But here's the truth. You're going to have this happen. It's just part of business. Sales is incentivized to make deals. Product is incentivized to build the right things. And those things are at some kind of tension. And your job as the PM isn't to eliminate the tension, it's to manage it. So you build processes, you have hard conversations, and you make sure that when sales makes a promise they can't keep, it's really uncomfortable for them. You're not punishing them, but you're helping them, we need to understand how this happened so it doesn't happen again way. Because every time you let it slide, you're training the rest of the organization to say that they can do it again. If sales promises the moon and it closes a deal, and your job is to make sure nobody's building a rocket ship without a blueprint, you're not blocking the deal. You're asking who approved the timeline, because if nobody checked and you're not blocking the deal, hopefully at best you're preventing a lawsuit when people come back at you. So there are some key phrases that you talked about, what I'll call power lines. And how do you use those phrases, those lines, without making them sound defensive or like you're just creating barriers and bureaucracy?
That's a very, very good question. And first of all, I would love to comment on what you just said. And I would definitely advise, if you have the capacity, that's not always the case, but sometimes if I see it will be like a very important deal with us, with our company, and I can propose that, then I propose to even be part of the pre-sales, some of the meetings, maybe even the first meeting or something like that. So I can actually be in the room and answer to some of the questions, obviously with having in mind to close that deal, but sometimes to just be that devil's attorney, to mention and just comment on a few things, so we don't even step in that point where we
Right.
are
That's
promising
great.
something that we will never deliver. Um, because unfortunately, there are situations where sales will not do it to harm you or anyone in the company. They're just so focused on closing that deal. They they just want to do their job right, and maybe sometimes too fast, so they don't check things with product or development. But having you there as a PO or PM can help them to not do that, right? So if that's an option, I would definitely advise to do that. If not, uh, then I'm always trying for any stakeholder or sales or whoever to really try to understand our position in which we are now, what they, like I said, we're not pointing fingers, but try to make them understand where are we now, and what we need to do in order to fulfill those needs. So I would definitely ask them to, to consider that, and explain in details of what is going on and what kind of challenges we are facing before they even got with this proposal, and then what is going on at this point. And when they realized what a mess has been made with their promising, they usually really understand, and that actually makes them not to repeat that mistake, let's say, right? But like you said, if you don't push on that, and that, I would say, emotion for them to feel what what we are feeling at this point, then I think it's very hard for them to understand, and also it will be very easy for them to make that mistake again. Um, and then sometimes, if it's really needed, if you're, for example, in a larger company, then there are always processes, right? So you can't have a request just by calling me on a meet or a call, or writing to me in an email. You have to go by the chain of command, right? You have to raise it properly. You have to raise a ticket or something like that, cover it with your boss, and that that boss goes to my boss or something like that. So you can make it harder for them. And when they see how hard it is, sometimes they don't pull it through. But that's the worst option you can do. Honestly, I'm not advising that. That is like the last call you can make. If someone is constantly overstepping the boundaries, they should be consider. So yeah, and in regarding the verbal and writing, because sometimes you will have written some kind of emails about what they're asking for. You always remind them, right, this current situation and the options. So what I love to do is to propose solutions, more solutions, but every solution will have pros and cons. And then, like you mentioned, and I think we mentioned a few times in this episode, is motivate them to make a decision with you. And that will be the healthiest for everyone. And then you align, and then everyone knows what are the next action steps. That's it.
Yep. And that documentation part, I think, is important. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds very, oh, why do I need to do that? But in the end, it can bite your ass. And it's better to have it than not to have it. Especially, like I said, I think in any company that has any politics in it, but uh, larger companies for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we're gonna sum all of this up and take one takeaway from today, I would say this. Prioritization is not a spreadsheet problem. It's a negotiation problem.
Yeah, and your job isn't to avoid conflict. It's really to navigate that conflict without losing trust.
Yeah, so true. But now we want to hear it from you, our audience. What is the worst prioritization story you've ever lived through?
Or if you want us to create a prioritization template, some scripts for saying no, tell us. We'll build whatever the audience feels like they really need.
Yeah. So, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, links will be in the description. Follow us so you don't miss the next one. And remember,
Good product managers don't have all the answers.
they know how to ask the right questions and say no without getting fired.
Yep. See you at the next one.
Yeah.